A while back, I did a video on grammar in music, and in that video I went over how to spell scales and what to name notes that are diatonic to those scales. But what do we do when we have out-of-key notes? Notes outside of the key are called accidentals. Accidentals are signified by a sharp, flat, or natural sign to the left of a note. Sharp means that the note is raised a semitone. Flat means the note's pitch is lowered by a semitone, and natural means that the note in the key was already sharp or flat to begin with, and you're just returning it to its natural pitch. But here's the thing. C sharp and D flat have the same sound. They're enharmonic. They're just two different names for the same note. Which one do you use? I have good news and bad news. Bad news first. There are no clear-cut ways to determine whether to use, for example, C sharp or D flat, or F sharp or G flat. The good news is that there are a few general guidelines that can help you determine what makes the most sense in a given context. So first, let's look at the big picture here. Music notation is for study and performance. That means that you and your musicians have to be able to read the score clearly. And sometimes certain notes will be easier to read than others for various reasons. So with that said, there are a few things that I've found that can really help you decide what to name out-of-key notes. Number one, as a general rule, if you're moving up to an out-of-key note, you should use a sharp. If you're moving down to an out-of-key note, you should use a flat. If the out-of-key note in question is not a sharp or flat note, and it's just a natural note, you're 90% of the time okay to use a natural sign. So don't worry about those, it's really the sharps and flats we're concerned about. This is pretty clear when doing chromatic runs. For example, in Way Back Home from Victory Goal 96, there's a part where some notes chromatically move upwards and then downwards, and you can see both of these ideas in action. In the key of E minor, we have this part going up from D to D sharp to E. Why use D sharp instead of E flat? Because you're moving up from D, so it just makes sense to go from D to D sharp. Similarly, when moving down here from B to B flat to A, the reason we use B flat instead of A sharp is just because you're moving down from B flat. It just makes the most sense to flatten B down to B flat. This alone will get you pretty far, but this one rule alone will not cut it in a lot of situations. Unfortunately, this will require some theory knowledge, but it's okay if you're not there yet. Just use what you know, and over time, you will start to learn what works and what doesn't. So guideline number 2, be aware of the function of the note and name it accordingly. This includes scales and chords. So, for example, the harmonic minor scale includes a raised 7th. So, if we were in the key of D minor, you'd be far more likely to see a C sharp as opposed to a D flat, because the harmonic minor scale is spelled with a raised 7th, which would bring C up to C sharp rather than D flat. So when working in the harmonic minor scale, even if you're moving down from D to C sharp, you wouldn't call it D flat just because you're moving down. You call it C sharp because you're naming it according to the scale that's being used. Luminous Sword from Sword Art Online demonstrates this idea. This is in the key of E minor, at least in this section, and it uses the D sharp from the harmonic minor scale. So you can see there, even though the melody is moving downwards from E to D sharp is still used instead of E flat because D sharp is a part of the harmonic minor scale. Those of you with good ears might have noticed the 5 chord of the key being played as the D sharp was being sung. That 5 chord is B major, and since B major is spelled B, D sharp, and F sharp, it makes sense to call this note D sharp instead of E flat to coincide with the spelling of the chord. In last week's video, I got a comment from somebody asking why I called one chord C sharp diminished 7 and then called another chord later in the same song D flat, when C sharp and D flat are the same note? And the answer for that is chord function. I knew that the C sharp diminished 7 chord was acting as essentially a rootless A7 chord, and since A7 is spelled with a C sharp, it made sense to name that based on that chord. On the other hand, the D flat chord, since this was in the key of F, the D flat chord was a flat 6 chord being borrowed from the parallel minor. And since in the parallel minor, it's spelled as D flat rather than C sharp, it makes sense to name it according to where it's coming from and call it D flat instead of C sharp. Hopefully I've explained all this in a way that makes sense to you. Just make clarity your top priority. To be honest, these guidelines I've set forth are debated by a lot of musicians. Not everybody likes the idea of having their melody notes named weirdly just to accommodate the chords being played underneath. As a composer and arranger myself, it makes sense for me to name things according to what's going on in the overall picture, to make everything kind of mesh together and it's all laid out and makes sense to me like that. Any guidelines set forth here can be ignored if it makes things difficult to read or understand. If you have sharps, flats, and naturals taking up half of your score, you may want to rethink how you're spelling things. In the end, just make sure you and your musicians understand what the music should sound like, and make clarity your top priority, and you should be just fine. My guitar teacher, who really got me into theory a few years ago, explained it to me this way. I had shown him a transcription I had done, and he was going over it, and he pointed out a note that was sharp and that should have been flattened. And he explained that if the note had been named something else, he would have thought the song was moving in a different direction than it was. For example, if I see a C sharp in the key of D minor, I know harmonic minor scale. But if I were to see a D flat in the key of D minor, I would think, oh, we're probably changing the key here. So these names do matter, and it's important that you take it into consideration. If you have any questions, you can comment below or email me at ongakuconcept.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.